In this video lesson, we'll explore the road to revolution and the Townshend Acts and the effect of the Boston Massacre on the American colonies. By mid-1766, the former Prime Minister, named William Pitt, who is pictured here, is replaced by a man named Lord Rockingham. Pitt had been admired both in England and America as capable and fair-minded, and he had been the savior in the French and Indian War for the British when it came to changing their military strategy. Pitt appoints a man named Charles Townshend as Chancellor of the Exchequer, who becomes the chief financial minister. Townshend's appointment set the stage for the first fatalities in the brewing revolution in the American colonies, and he proposes something called the Revenue Act of 1767. The Revenue Act of 1767 created new taxes on tea, glass, lead, paper, and paint, and was designed to be paid by the importer up front, but passed on to consumers in the retail price when they purchased the item. Townshend assumes Americans would find these external taxes more acceptable than the internal taxes that they had attempted to levy, such as the Stamp Act. This was a reasonable assumption considering that the 3% tax on molasses established by the Revenue Act of 1765 had been lowered to 1 cent in 1766, and the Sugar Act was producing a lot of money annually without any further objections from the colonists. However, the Revenue Act of 1767 contained a controversial provision. Specifically, some revenue raised by the law would go to pay the salaries of royal governors, depriving the colonists of their power of the purse, which meant that the colonists and the colonial assemblies were used to paying the salaries of the royal governors and thereby being able to exert control over what they did. Prior to 1767, colonial legislatures had paid the salaries of these officials, and this new law gave the royal governors greater autonomy or independence in making decisions for the colonies. Townshend was particularly concerned about the New York legislature because it did not enforce one of the acts that had been passed called the Quartering Act of 1765. The Quartering Act was a law that was requiring New Yorkers to shelter and provision troops that were stationed there. In response, Townshend pushed the passage of the New York Suspending Act, which suspended meetings of the legislature and declared its acts null and void until it complied with the Quartering Act. In 1767, the Revenue Act's controversial provision and the suspension of the New York Assembly caused Americans to fear for their political freedoms and their right for self-government. The Massachusetts legislature protested against the Townshend duties by circulating a letter of grievances to other colonial assemblies written by Sam Adams and James Otis. The circular letter, as it came to be called, argued that parliamentary taxation amounted to illegal taxation because only the colonial assemblies had the power to tax the colonists. It also said that the 1767 Revenue Act subverted the proper relationship between the people and their rulers, urged other assemblies to endorse the circular letter and to suggest other solutions. In response, Parliament's Lord Hillsborough ordered Massachusetts Governor Bernard to dissolve the Massachusetts Assembly unless it repudiated the circular letter. Governor Bernard dissolved the Massachusetts legislature when it refused his demand and created a political upheaval as a result in Boston during the summer of 1768. Boston retaliated against colonial authorities for dissolving the legislature by passing non-consumption agreements, resolutions which called for a boycott of all British-made goods. Between 1767 and 1768, other towns passed similar resolutions. Non-consumption agreements presented opportunities for women to demonstrate their patriotism because many of their blacklisted British products were household goods, so women began to create their own household goods and not buy from the British. and they attempted to continue to boycott British goods. The Daughters of Liberty was formed by women not only to boycott British goods, but to make substitutes such as homespun clothing. Non-consumption agreements were successful, but non-importation agreements were more effective because they targeted merchants that were importing British goods. The boycotts cut imports in the colonies by over 40%, hurt British manufacturers and merchants, and pressured Parliament to end the dispute. Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson's family was also prevented from importing and selling. A group called the Edenton Tea Ladies of North Carolina, as shown in the cartoon that you see in the video, were women who renounced the goods, hurting the British apparel and tea, and who meddled in politics and all right, let's try that again. The Edenton Tea Ladies of North Carolina was a group of women who declared it their duty to support the boycotting of all British goods. The British man who drew this cartoon was basically satirizing this event and using it as propaganda to say that women who renounced goods, who were meddling in politics, would undermine the men financially, neglect their families, and fall prey to wanton sexuality. So basically, the British man who drew this cartoon was warning against groups of women like this getting involved politically in the rebellious acts. Both governors, Bernard and Hutchinson, concluded that British troops were needed to restore order in the colonies. In the fall of 1868, 3,000 British troops arrived to occupy Boston, and Bostonians were very irritated by their arrival and very conscious that they were being watched. By January 1770, Governor Hutchinson's two sons, both Boston importers, began ordering British goods again, despite the boycott. In mid-February, in response to that, a Boston mob surrounded Ebenezer Richardson's home, and basically there was tension rising. A customs official who was panicked by the crowd that was mobilizing fired a warning shot and accidentally killed a young boy. Richardson's actions ignited protests in Boston, and the Sons of Liberty are going to be organized and are going to organize a massive funeral procession to mark the first killing in the struggle with England. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, a small number of Bostonians surrounded one British soldier guarding the customs house of Captain Thomas Preston. Fearing for the sentry's safety, 7 more soldiers were sent to back him up. The crowd was harassing the soldiers, throwing snowballs, sticks, and other objects at them, calling them lobsterbacks, and generally showing that they did not want the British soldiers there. Fearing the mob, the British soldiers raised their muskets and fire on the crowd, killing 5 men and wounding 6 others. The colonists then call this the Boston Massacre, or the Bloody Massacre. And even though this only lasted a few minutes, it created a debate in the colonies over who was actually responsible for the killings. In the aftermath, Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson ordered the removal of British troops from Boston to an island in the harbor to appease the townspeople and prevent further violence. This propaganda was created by Paul Revere, and this is actually an etching that was created and shown as propaganda throughout the colonies by the Sons of Liberty and the Committees of Correspondence to try to portray a certain view of the events in the colonies. Captain Preston and the 8 soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre were jailed and tried before a Boston court and defended by John Adams, which you saw in the video a few days ago. Basically, 2 were convicted of manslaughter, branded on the thumbs, and released. But in the end, they were found not guilty. They were found in defense of themselves. In March 1770, Lord Frederick North became England's new prime minister, and he held the office for the next 12 years. Lord North, wishing prosperity for British merchants and peace with the colonies, convinced Parliament to repeal the townshend duties except for the tax on tea. Within 2 years, trade is going to begin again and be revived, and a more cooperative atmosphere prevails, but some, out of principle, smuggle Dutch tea rather than buy English tea. In 1772, several incidents occurred that in 1775 resulted in war with the American colonies. One of them, called the Gatsby Affair, involved Americans burning a Royal Navy ship that had run aground while chasing suspected smugglers off the coast of Rhode Island. An investigation into the Gatsby Affair failed to identify any suspects or result in any arrests. However, anyone found to have participated in the act was put on notice that they would stand in England for high treason. In 1772, North proposed to pay the salaries of Superior Court judges in Boston out of tea tax revenue, which raised suspicions among the Americans that there was a plot to destroy their freedoms by taking away the right of the purse, or the right of them to be able to pay people who were in the British employ in the colonies. In response to North's plan for judges' salaries, a committee of